Thanks for joining us for today's podcast. I'm Sean Schmidt with The Silver Sheet. Big changes are in store for device manufacturers whose quality systems follow ISO 13485. For example, when the latest version of the international standard is released, likely later this year, firms will have to pay much more attention to risk management activities. ISO 13485 is the quality system standard for medical device manufacturing developed by the International Organization for Standardization. It is used in Australia, Canada, Japan, and the European Union, among other countries. In this Silver Sheet visual podcast, Bill Brodbeck, Director of Regulatory Affairs at sterilization and decontamination technology firm Steris, encourages manufacturers to ask themselves 9 questions related to risk activities when making product modifications. Further, he tells how risk management will play into post-market surveillance under a newly reworked ISO 13485. This podcast is a preview of a presentation that Brodbeck will give at the upcoming MedCon 2015 Industry Conference hosted by FDA and Xavier University. Take it away, Bill.
Well, thank you, Sean. I appreciate that. As Sean may have mentioned, my name is Bill Brodbeck. I am with Steris Corporation out near Cleveland, Ohio. And what I'm going to be talking about today is part of a very small part of a larger series that's going to be taking place at MedCon 2015. This particular session is going to be on Wednesday, May 6th. It is going to be part of the Track 2 program. And this particular set of presentations are starting at 1:05. And what you'll see for that series is that we're planning on to discuss the overall changes that are planned for the new ISO 13485 revisions that we now call 20XX, simply because while we hope that they're going to be available and implemented in 2015, there's still no guarantee. But in the very first session, presentation of that session, you will hear a number of these changes and become familiar with those or proposed changes at this point. And then secondly, you hear about a regulator's view regarding those changes up to 13485. And last but not least, you also hear how risk management is addressed throughout the new standard. So what I'd like to do today is to talk a little bit about how these revisions to 13485 will affect, or at least how you can integrate risk management into the new standard once it's released. So on the next slide, the very first thing we have to be familiar with are the terms. Now, unlike the previous revision of 13485, this new revision actually addresses the term risk, and hopefully you understand that risk is the combination of probability and of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. Well, in order to understand what that definition means, you have to understand what harm means. And harm is defined as the physical injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property or the environment. And we also have to consider the terms hazard and hazardous situation, which are defined here for you. On the next slide, the new revision of the ISO 13485 also contains the term risk management in the definitions. And as you probably know, the risk management is defined as a systemic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. Well, in the full presentation that you'll be seeing at MedCon, we'll get a little bit into types of policies, procedures, and practices. But for now, let's just focus on that second group of terms in there, highlighted in green, regarding analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk, because these are really the action items that you have to be familiar with. And in order to understand how this is going to integrate with 13485, you need to understand how you should be performing these tasks. So on the next slide, we have the first two terms, analyzing and evaluating. And analyzing has to deal with identifying the characteristics related to the safety of the medical device, as well as identifying the hazards and estimating the risk for each hazardous situation. Regarding the estimation of risk, that can be kind of tricky. There's a number of different ways that you can estimate the risks, and hopefully during the presentation at MedCon we can actually give you some ideas as to best methods to estimate risks. But really we're talking about looking at those risks and trying to get an idea of the best methods to estimate how those risks can impact the safety or effectiveness of the device. We also can define evaluating as combining the probability and severity to determine if risk reduction is required. So estimation of risk is actually getting at methods to identify the probability of occurrence and severity of a particular risk. When you're evaluating, you're going to be combining those two measurements in order to evaluate whether or not you need to implement any type of risk reduction or risk mitigations. Next slide is dealing with controlling and monitoring. So obviously if you identify that there are risks that need to be mitigated or controlled, then you must obviously have methods of controlling those risks. Right now, the best methods are inherent safety by design. So if you identify something through your risk management system that needs to be controlled, you should consider that you build in that control mechanism into the design itself, or include any protective measures. One thing that you cannot do is use information for safety to control risks. So you cannot mitigate or control a risk through labeling of a product or information provided to the customer. Once you have those controls in place and you feel that you have significantly reduced the risks, or at least to a acceptable level, then you need, once that product is released, you need to monitor risks. And that means continuously checking for information to identify new risks or potential changes in estimations for already identified risks. And you need to analyze, evaluate, and control any newly identified risks. When we're talking about the revisions of 1345, we're going to see that essentially those deal directly with monitoring of risks, at least what we'll be talking about today. In the next slide, we're going to start addressing some of these changes in 1345. Specifically, if we look at the section that deals with design changes, we see the following: that the review of design and development changes shall include evaluation of the effect of the changes on, and as you see B there, outputs of risk management. So design changes need to have an evaluation of your risk management system that has already been completed for a device. So once your design is complete and released, any changes that occur to that device must then be evaluated in terms of risk. As seen on the next slide, we're going to talk about what we need to do for risk management once the design change occurs. Now, what we'll be doing in the full session at MedCon is talking about possible best practices in order to implement design changes. What I'd like to do just shortly here is identify how risk management is impacted, or what considerations you need to give to your risk management system based upon the design change. So you need to ask the following questions. Does the change introduce any new risks? So you may have a design either for remediation or to solve a customer issue, or a design improvement of any type. You really need to get down to the meat of that and ask yourself, does this introduce any new risks? By improving the device, is there any new risks? For example, if you automated something in the device, does that introduce a new risk for that automation? Also, you need to ask, does the probability of occurrence of the risk change, whether for the better or for worse? If you remove a certain feature, you may actually eliminate the probability of a certain risk occurring. If you add a feature, obviously you may increase the probability. So you need to evaluate that, as well as does the severity of the risk change based upon that design change. Obviously, if you change the probability of severity, then it's likely that your estimated risk will change. Then you really have to ask yourself, if risk control that you have identified from previous verification and validation for that device, is that still valid? In other words, does that design change require you to go back and re-verify or revalidate the device performance in any way because the initial verification and validation activities are invalid because of that change? And does that directly impact your risk. So you may be using verification and validation as a risk mitigation, and if that verification and validation is no longer valid, obviously, then your risk mitigation is no longer valid. So you may need to repeat some of that. Is the overall risk still acceptable? Have you increased the overall risk? Is the particular failure mode risk-benefit analysis still valid? And is the overall risk-benefit analysis still acceptable? So that is a number of different questions that you need to address once you implement a design change. Most importantly, I can't say most importantly, but obviously importantly, are these considerations and justifications documented? So you need to have some system in place that whether or not that any risk management documents need to be changed based upon the design change, then you still need to justify and document whether or not that is the case. Next slide. So a second area that we can discuss regarding the revisions to 13485 is in the section of monitoring and measurement. If we read into that, the proposed revision states that the information gathered in the feedback process shall serve as input into risk management for monitoring and maintaining the product requirements, as well as potential input into the product realization processes. On the next slide, let's talk about what this information, as I underlined there, really is. So what information are we talking about? It's mainly quality data. And different forms of quality data come in as complaints, medical device reports, corrective and preventive actions, or non-conforming reports, and I'm sure there's a number of different quality metrics that we can add here. But what we're saying is that the information that you want to feed directly into your risk management processes, it can kind of come from this quality data. On the next slide, we see what about these inputs into risk management. Well, quality data actually provides real numbers. Hopefully you know that when you are estimating risks in your initial risk analysis, that these are all going to be based upon projections, possibly with similar devices or devices of a different family within your own company, or what's already out there from a competitor or similar device altogether. Once you start getting quality data, you can actually see the actual probability of occurrence of certain risks occurring in the field. So you should use that data and go back into your risk management system and apply that real data for these outcomes. And the outcomes being the severity. So something that you may not have provided or thought about during your original risk assessment may be actually something that can occur out in the field, or something that you may have thought being a very low severity might actually turn out to be very high severity, depending upon what you see occurring with your device once it's released. So what you need to do is refer back to your original risk analysis and update that probability or severity and obviously your estimated risk based upon those metrics. Also, on the next slide, you need to address whether that verification and validation still provide appropriate risk control, just as we did for design changes. You need to address whether or not the overall device risk is still acceptable, whether or not the either failure mode or overall risk benefit assessment is still valid. So if you get something, for example, out in the field that increases the severity of a risk or severity of several risks, once you have that quality data in hand and you can analyze that, if you increase the severity, you may realize that, well, it may not be beneficial. The benefit may not still outweigh the risks associated with the device. So that obviously needs to be updated in your risk management file. Next slide. So now that you have all these great inputs going into your risk management system based upon your quality data, what are the outputs? What are you expected to do once you actually update your risk management file? Well, obviously you need to document that appropriately. And once you have that documentation, this may drive additional actions. Once you update that risk management file, you may realize that you actually need to implement a design change, and then you're back into the system that we talked about earlier, which any design change may affect the risks. Hopefully at this point, if you're updating the design in order to address a risk, hopefully you're going to mitigate risks. However, as we talked about earlier, even though you're implementing a design change to address a risk, it actually may introduce new risks, and you may want to address those. If you see any of the information coming in from the quality data that you're gathering may affect the risk management file and therefore the risk of the device, you may want to implement corrective and preventive actions in order to address that in your quality system analysis. And last but not least, if you have a severe risk, you may want to actually initiate a correction or removal. So with that being said, I do appreciate your attention, and I look forward to seeing you all at MedCon for the full presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. That was extremely informative, and it's a topic that all device manufacturers should keep a close eye on. And thank you for listening. Please visit thegraysheet.com for more podcasts.